History is full of turning points, moments where the old rules just stop working and a new reality is forged. For generations, the story of Canada was one of a quiet, steady partnership with its southern neighbor. It was an alliance built on the world's longest undefended border, deeply integrated economies, and shared values. Well, that story is over. In early 2026, one of the most stable relationships in the world was deliberately fractured, not by some foreign adversary, but from within. It was an act of economic aggression that was supposed to bring Canada to its knees. Instead, it ignited a firestorm. This is the story of how a nation, pushed to the brink, fought back with a multi-billion-dollar counterpunch, started rewriting its own economic destiny, and exposed the stunning hypocrisy at the heart of American foreign policy. This is Canada's Economic Declaration of Independence. It all started on February 1, 2026. Donald Trump thought he had his northern neighbor cornered. In a stunning move, his administration slapped Canada with a wave of crippling new tariffs. And just to make it clear who was in charge, he did this. After the U.S. Supreme Court had tried to block him, he expected a swift, quiet surrender. What he got instead was a declaration of economic war. On March 4th, after a tense month of negotiations failed, Canada delivered a $30 billion counterpunch, and a new prime minister stood before the world and declared that the long, comfortable era of depending on the United States was officially over. To really get how audacious Canada's response was, you have to understand the American provocation. This wasn't just another trade spat. This was a calculated attempt to destabilize the entire Canadian economy. The campaign began in early 2025, with the Trump administration threatening massive tariffs on its two largest trading partners, Canada and Mexico. The official reason was flimsy, linked to border security issues that didn't really apply to the northern border. The real goal was leverage, brutal, unapologetic economic force. The threats hung like a cloud over North America for a year. Then, in February 2026, something remarkable happened. The U.S. Supreme Court actually struck down the administration's authority to impose these specific tariffs. For any normal administration, that would have been the end of it. But this was not a normal administration. The White House just found a different legal justification and pushed the tariffs through anyway. The message was chilling. No law, no treaty, and no court would stand in the way. On February 1, 2026, the tariffs became a reality, a punishing 25% on autos, steel, and aluminum, with threats of more to come. It was a body blow aimed right at the heart of the Canadian economy. But the attack wasn't just economic. It was also a bizarre psychological campaign. In interviews and on social media, Donald Trump openly mused about annexing Canada, dismissing the border as an artificially drawn line. He started calling Canada's leader governor, not prime minister. He claimed falsely that the U.S. does very little business with Canada and that the relationship was a one-way street. "They need us," he declared. "We don't need them." This wasn't just trash talk. It was a strategy to create an existential crisis. The United States had declared economic war, assuming its quiet, polite neighbor would just fold. They assumed wrong. The American attack landed just as Canada was navigating its own political transition. The era of Justin Trudeau had come to an end, and in his place stood a new prime minister, Mark Carney. And he has a very different background. He's not a career politician. He's a globally respected economist who served as governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. This is a man who understands the global financial system inside and out, and he wasn't about to let his country be bullied. While it was the Trudeau government that first announced the retaliation framework, it was Carney's new administration that would see it through. After a month-long delay for negotiations went nowhere, Canada's response on March 4th was delivered with breathtaking speed and force. There was no hesitation, no pleading for exemptions. There was only a cold, hard, retaliatory strike. Canada announced it was imposing its own counter-tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods, effective immediately. This was the shot heard round the financial world. But it didn't stop there. Carney's government made it clear this was just the opening salvo. They announced that after a 3-week period, the retaliation would escalate dramatically, expanding to cover a staggering CA 125 to 155 billion in U.S. exports. The signal was crystal clear. Canada would match American aggression dollar for dollar, and then some. Canadians are reasonable and we are polite, a government statement declared, capturing the national mood. But we will not back down from a fight. This decisive action was part of a fundamental shift in Canadian strategy. In a landmark speech, Carney declared that the decades-long era of ever closer economic integration with the United States had to end. He called it a rupture, a moment where Canada's greatest strength, its deep ties to the U.S. market, had suddenly become its greatest weakness. The old assumption of a reliable, rules-based American partner was dead. Canada, he argued, had to move from a position of reliance to resilience. It was time to stop being a dependent branch office and become a sovereign global player. The era of being the compliant little brother was over. So, what does a CA 30 billion act of economic revenge actually look like? It looks like a meticulously crafted list of pain. Canadian counter-tariffs weren't a blunt instrument. They were a surgical tool designed to inflict maximum economic and, more importantly, political damage. This wasn't about raising revenue. It was about changing behavior by hitting the Trump administration's political base right where it hurts. The strategy was a masterclass in political targeting, using a playbook Canada had successfully deployed in a previous trade dispute in 2018. The list of targeted goods read like a map of politically sensitive American states. Kentucky bourbon, a symbol of the bluegrass state and a key export for Senate leadership, was hit hard. Harley-Davidson motorcycles from Wisconsin, home to other key political figures, faced the same penalty. The list went on, a comprehensive assault on iconic American goods. Ketchup from states like Ohio was on the list. So were lawnmowers, yogurt, orange juice, and even playing cards. From refrigerators and dishwashers to toilet paper and pencils, the message was clear. No sector would be immune. Then came the heavy hitters. Steel and aluminum. In a direct response to U.S. duties, Canada fired back with its own tariffs on billions of dollars of American metal products. This created a nightmare for American producers who now faced a new tax when selling into their largest export market. It squeezed their margins and disrupted their supply chains. The very industries the White House claimed it was protecting were now caught in a trade war they never asked for. And always, there was the looming threat of escalation. That initial $30 billion list was just phase one. The Canadian government held the power to expand those tariffs to cover another CA $125 billion in goods, a threat that kept American industries in a constant state of anxiety. This uncertainty itself became a weapon. American businesses could no longer count on predictable access to the Canadian market. Canadian companies began looking elsewhere, rewriting supply contracts and designing American producers out of their long-term plans. The revenge wasn't just the immediate cost of the tariffs, it was the slow, grinding erosion of trust. Canada's counter-tariffs were the immediate punchback, but Prime Minister Carney knew that a purely defensive fight wasn't enough. Winning this economic war meant going on offense. It required breaking the chains of dependency that had left Canada so vulnerable. This was the dawn of the Great Diversification. For decades, Canadian trade policy was simple. Focus on America. Before the crisis, a staggering 75% of all Canadian exports went to a single country. That over-reliance, once a source of strength, was now an existential threat. Carney's government made a conscious decision to change that calculus, forever. The strategy was twofold. First, strengthen the bridges that were already built. Two massive trade deals, largely overlooked during the years of stable U.S. relations, were suddenly thrust into the spotlight. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, and the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA. The CPTPP is a free trade bloc connecting Canada to major economies in the Asia-Pacific like Japan and Australia. While the U.S. was building tariff walls, Canada was tearing them down with some of the world's fastest-growing economies. Then there's CETA, the free trade deal with the entire European Union. As tensions with Washington peaked in early 2026, Carney's government was in Europe, actively working to upgrade and expand that deal, making it easier for Canadian goods and services to enter the EU tariff-free. The second part of the strategy was building new bridges, literally. The Carney government launched an aggressive new agenda focused on nation-building projects. This meant expediting pipelines to get Canadian energy to the coasts, expanding ports on both the Atlantic and Pacific, and developing critical mineral resources to supply new partners in Asia and Europe. It was a conscious effort to physically reorient the Canadian economy away from its north-south axis and towards a new global east-west reality. The government also pushed to tear down internal trade barriers between provinces, aiming to create a more unified domestic market that could serve as a powerful platform for global exports. Canada's economic future would no longer be decided in Washington, D.C. It would be forged through new partnerships in Tokyo, Berlin, and beyond. So, what was the result of all this? The Trump administration's plan backfired, spectacularly. The attempt to strong-arm Canada didn't create a pushover. It created a defiant new competitor, and it was American businesses, workers, and consumers who started paying the price. The most immediate impact was felt in the very sectors the tariffs were supposed to help. American steel and aluminum producers hit by Canadian counter-tariffs saw their market share in Canada shrink. For businesses like Morales, a Quebec-based cabinet maker, the trade uncertainty forced them to start looking for suppliers outside of the United States. That story was repeated across countless industries, a slow-motion decoupling of the world's most integrated economic relationship. The pain wasn't just economic, it was political. Canada's targeted tariffs sent shockwaves through key American states. Farmers in the Midwest saw demand for their products soften. Distillers in Kentucky watched as the price of their bourbon jumped on Canadian shelves, making Scottish and Irish whiskey look a lot more attractive. These were real financial hits to the wallets of Trump's own voters. Then there was the looming deadline of July 1, 2026, the date for the mandatory joint review of the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, USMCA. The White House clearly intended to use its tariffs as leverage to force concessions, but Canada's powerful and swift retaliation changed the whole dynamic. Instead of negotiating from a position of weakness, Canada was now at the table with a diversifying trade portfolio and a proven willingness to fight back. The prospect of a smooth USMCA review was suddenly in doubt, and that uncertainty sent a chill through corporate leaders who rely on stable North American supply chains. The stock market shuddered in response to the escalating tariff announcements in March 2026, a clear sign that this self-inflicted trade war was undermining the economy. The events of 2026 will be remembered as a watershed moment for North America. It was the year the United States turned on its closest friend, and its friend refused to turn the other cheek. The Trump administration's declaration of economic war, meant to be a show of overwhelming force, was met with a calculated, powerful response that nobody in the White House saw coming. Canada's revenge was more than just a set of counter-tariffs. It was a strategic masterpiece. It inflicted targeted political pain, created massive uncertainty for American businesses, and kick-started a fundamental rewiring of the Canadian economy. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney's leadership, Canada shrugged off its cloak of dependency and started forging a new path. The Great Diversification isn't just a policy. It's Canada's new reality, a future built on global partnerships, not fragile reliance on a single, unpredictable neighbor. The backfire for the United States has been profound. The tariffs inflicted self-harm on American industries, spooked financial markets, and threw the future of continental trade into chaos. But more than that, the conflict shattered the bedrock of trust the U.S.-Canada relationship was built on, a loss that could take decades to repair. The ultimate irony is that in trying to force Canada into submission, Donald Trump accidentally pushed it to become more independent, more resilient, and more globally minded than ever before. He handed Canada the perfect reason to finally break free. The attempt to make Canada bend the knee only taught it how to stand on its own 2 feet. The revenge wasn't just about getting even, it was about getting free. If you want to understand the forces reshaping our world, from trade wars to shifting alliances, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell. We cut through the noise to bring you analysis you won't find anywhere else. Now I want to hear from you. Was Canada's response a brilliant strategic move or a high-stakes gamble? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And be sure to check out our next video where we break down how the US is losing the new race for critical minerals. You won't want to miss it.